Welcome to the Disruptance Podcast. The Disruptance Podcast is the show that disrupts the way entrepreneurs think to make them more profitable and impactful. Rethink tired and outdated business norms to welcome innovation and unlock your unlimited possibilities. Here are your hosts, Eric Forney and Greg Fowler.
Eric, I'm super excited about this one, my friend. This particular topic we're going to be covering today, I think is something that a lot of people are curious about. I think ultimately in the day and age where everything is about communication and relationships, really asking great questions and skipping the small talk is really what we're trying to evaluate. And I know you've had a lot of conversations in your life through leadership and entrepreneurialism, through real estate, to really engage with the target audience and just people in your life. I think we're both in agreement that it is important to ask great questions to receive data that we can actually do something with. But ultimately, I look at it for breaking down walls and barriers and connecting in an emotional and a meaningful way. So I don't know kind of the generalized flow, but this came up and I've had so many people ask me just over all the years. I mean, I've interviewed thousands of professionals, well over a decade, just who they are, where they're from, what makes them tick, understanding those deep dive kind of questions. There's a lot of surface level that I think people go through, but to really get to the meat, to get down to who that person is, it's not easy. So I think for us to just go down the line here, I've kind of looked back at all these years and distilled down, key components that anybody could apply if they want to be a better communicator, but ask better questions to get better answers and results. But I'd love to just go back and forth, man, just kind of see where this hashes out for the audience.
Perfect. I'll be sure to ask you lots of questions then.
Only great questions, though. No surface level. No,
Okay.
That's the important thing. We're setting the precedent. The interesting thing that always comes up is, well, how was it? And everybody's been into that sort of scenario if they have kids or if they have a spouse. It's kind of that generalized how was it question. And people get asked the same things over and over and over again. There's a level of irritation. So I think ultimately just learning the processes, this use case for asking better questions, to me, I just kind of have a little dialogue. Where can this affect a life as far as asking better questions and getting rid of it? Networking events, listing appointments, buyer consultations, business opportunities. If you're looking for sphere of influence or follow-up, if it's leads or database cold calling, really cold outreach and email, DM engagement. There's so many use cases for asking good questions and understanding this process we're going to cover. But then it goes past that, Eric. And you and I talked about this before we hit record, really communicating with friends, with family, looking at it just to understand where somebody is and where they're coming from, I think is a big thing. So with that being said, I want to go through and I listed out 9. We might add more, take some away. But the first one that kind of pops in my mind, I'd love your perspective on it, Eric, is asking questions beyond the obvious ones.
Okay.
So, looking at it from a standpoint, when you first meet somebody or you have a conversation with a team member, or if it's a client or anything along those lines, I think you look at it from a standpoint is most people don't do enough research or preparation ahead of time before a conversation. So they just assume that I'm going to wing it because I've had so many conversations. I've dealt with so many people over all these years. I know it just in the top of my head. I think to have deep conversations, you really need to know who you're talking to and who the end user is. So I think doing research before you meet with somebody, if it's cold, I think is important. So a buyer, a seller, if it ends up being refer a partner, if it's somebody who's joining the team of the organization, I think looking at it from that standpoint of researching and knowing things that are a little bit deeper than just what's on their signature block or what's in their short bio on their social media account. What are your thoughts on, kind of doing research ahead of time, asking questions beyond the obvious ones? Where do you go from there?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you have the ability to capture additional insights and information prior to a meeting, it's going to be far more effective, right? I mean, when you go to the doctor's office, the doctor has a nurse that does the intake, and at the end of the day, intake becomes question asking. And if the intake didn't occur, it would be malpractice. And so I think that questions then become the differential between malpractice and preferred treatment. And so the positions you have to operate from then when thinking about questions is if you have no context or if you have context. If you have no context, you have to do needs analysis, you have to do discovery. And needs analysis and discovery only happen through curiosity and through unanswered and unknown assumptions. So I start from the framework that if I do research on someone, I'm going to gather whatever information I can get, but I still need to go in with the level of curiosity that some of my assumptions may not be as accurate as I interpreted. So I start from the framework then of how do I ask thought-provoking curiosity questions in order to do that discovery. But sometimes if you're a politician, you don't get the ability to do the research.
True.
Therefore, you lean on universal principle-based questions.
And I think that's a great example. And I love the fact that you utilize the, doctor-patient kind of diagnosis and the setup ahead of time. I think that it's just going to be overall better outcomes when you're trying to get to the root of the individual and solve problems or communicate effectively. I think when you look at it from that standpoint too, Eric, this is kind of a natural progression into the second identifier. People ask me, hey, Greg, you've interviewed so many great people. You had incredible conversations. How do you do that? How do you kind of break through? For me, the identified second nature is what is classified or qualified is what I break it down as use the question preamble. So by doing the research ahead of time based off of who you're communicating with, you can kind of show them that their highlight reel. I think that it's important for that person that you're communicating with. Wow, okay, so they're researched. They took the time. They didn't just wing this. They showed up ready to have a meaningful conversation. It shows that you are attention to detail sort of scenario. I think ultimately, if you have the possibility, depending on who you're talking to, if there's information that you can gather that's past the public reach, that sort of scenario, then you'd want to do that. I think that ultimately it's going to open people up to say, oh my gosh, think of how Eric shows up to a conversation this way and he knows different things about me that isn't open to the normal understanding. It just breaks barriers down. It softens the thoughts. So what are your thoughts about kind of, spitting out a highlight reel or that sort of scenario? Or we can go into kind of the third one, which is I like to look at it from a parroting standpoint. So let's go this way, Eric. When somebody has a conversation, to reiterate the fact that you are listening to them above and beyond, kind of repeating what they're saying to a certain degree. Do you have a formula with that? Is there a strategy that you have when you're listening and then are parroting or repeating?
Yeah.
What's kind of your takeaway or thought to that?
Somebody who has one functional hearing ear, it's actually just the way that you go through life is just repeating back things that people say to you. And so, it's probably both a learned skill and then a necessary adaptation. But I think it's one of the most effective ways to get additional context, right? The goal is twofold. It's what you said. It's to make someone feel heard and then to gather additional context, because funny enough, we're all pretty well trained to follow patterns. We've all well adopted to this Pavlov dog theory of when someone repeats back what in paraphrases, we pause and then typically fill in the blanks or elaborate on additional context. And so in a sales process or in a curiosity perspective, you give someone the best feeling on earth, which is feeling heard and understood. There's nothing more empowering and more satisfying than believing that someone understands you. And when you repeat, paraphrase, and pause, then you end up with giving someone that permission to feel understood, but you also gain the additional insights that you're looking for having them fill in the blank or adding color to the conversation that was left out. And so I operate from this framework when I'm thinking about questions or when I'm thinking about conversations. If I really get in the habit of knowing the difference between perspective and perception, if I understand the difference between how I heard something versus what they mean,
Mm,
because, I'm part of Team Words Matter, and yet most are not part of Team Words Matter. And as a byproduct of that, language and communication becomes incredibly challenging
mhm,
because most of the time people communicate with shortcuts. People
mhm.
communicate with jargon. They communicate with buzzwords. They communicate with ambiguity. And so then your job as a communicator is to extract meaning and understanding so that you gain their perception.
Mm.
You can't make change until until you know where someone is. The only way you know where someone is to actually understand their perspective, not yours.
That is super powerful into that nature, Eric. And again, this is going past the surface level and really paying attention to those details. I think
There's
everyone.
nothing worse than a surface level conversation, Greg. Like I can't think of much. I would take like, colonoscopies over like small talk if you gave me the option.
Oh, good
Hands
man.
down.
Not
Like
not so much the prep of the colonoscopy, but the
no,
other
that's how much I hate small talk. I would still do both.
sports, weather, what's going on. Yeah, no, I totally get
No, no,
that into that
joking.
realm with the small talk. This is an important thought though, because we're touching on it here as the emotional side of it, and that's something that I always reflect on. Steering the conversation towards emotional, thought processes, not the surface level as we both dislike so much. And I think that ultimately this sets up the stage for, if we research who we're talking to or understand where they're coming from or truly listening and parroting, then we go back to the equation of, okay, what are they really looking for this outcome? And what is this individual person passionate about? What are they really driven for? Um, Anytime you ask somebody something that they're passionate about, it opens it up. Now, to me, the best way that I like to go about doing this and into key components as I kind of put this into perspective, it's the best and worst structure, or the highlight low light structure. So,
Okay.
Eric, what is your best thought process when you've lived in XYZ place, and what was the worst
Gotcha.
part about living in XYZ place? The great thing about that is people want to talk
I
about what
like it.
they love. They're very engaged with that, but they also have now permission to talk about things that they hate or dislike, where most people
True.
won't go there. They won't. They'll talk about
Yeah.
happiness, but they won't talk about the sad side. So I like the highlight, low light.
Okay. I like the
To me,
framework. Not familiar with it.
it's a way to open up a conversation. So to that end, what are your thoughts on steering conversations towards emotional tendencies? How do you evoke the conversation to go deeper? I mean, I told you I use the highlight, low light,
Yeah.
best experience, worst experience sort of scenario. You can use that personal or business, but what comes to mind when you think about steering conversations towards emotion?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if through it from the sales framework or through, I guess there's really like two ways that questions show up regularly. It's either in business
Hmm.
or in personal life. Now I realize that there's some listener that goes, "Yeah, no shit, Eric. Is there some other realm that you live in?" And the answer is no.
Oh.
And and so questions show up most in parenting, though,
Mm.
probably more than they do at work. Now it doesn't mean that for the listener, if questions don't show up frequently in parenting, that they're doing it wrong. It's just that we have a very different philosophy on parenting. That's all,
Mhm.
and all of which can be highly successful. Right? There are times in life where you tell your kids, and then there are times you understand them by asking questions.
Mhm.
And so when I'm thinking about the emotion, is one of the most effective ways to is to gain emotion
Mhm.
or to get access to it is to label it.
Ooh. Okay.
And so if I'm thinking through this, like I'm working with a prospect or I'm working with Hudson, if it's apparent to me what emotion is displayed, either way, even if I'm wrong, I'm still going to label it. So
Mm.
Greg, it seems like you're really anxious.
Mhm.
Or Greg, it seems like you're really worried about that. Or Greg, what are you fearful of? It
Mm.
seems like you are, and I'm going to label that emotion. What I find is that people elaborate on that because here's what we don't love is being labeled.
Mm.
The mainstream media loves to label us, but people, we hate to be labeled. And
Mm.
we especially hate to be labeled wrong because we're misunderstood.
Ooh, yeah.
And because we desperately seek understanding when we're misunderstood, we repel the labels that are projected onto us.
Hmm.
So that creates some access to gaining insight into emotion, is to mislabel or label the emotion that you perceive.
Hmm.
And then to pause and create the gap. Then you can start to unpack some of the deeper questions that come after that.
Yeah, I really enjoy that perspective as you're mentioning it, because it evokes that deeper thought. You're not just going at it; you're really trying to get their understanding. It's a way to kind of tease it out, and that gives a good process into the next aspect here. And this is not for everybody. This takes time. Like everything that we're mentioning here, Eric, it is years and years of practice and preparation and
Can
constant.
I just disagree? Can I disagree with you on that? And I say that only because I think we learned it, and I think we do it naturally, and then we unlearned it somehow. Like you have, your daughter's what, yeah, like 6 months, a year different in age than Hudson, and
Yeah,
yesterday or like 2 days. Well, yesterday was his birthday, but so like 2 days ago, 3 days ago, whatever it was, he said, "Dad, what does explain mean?"
Hmm.
There was no conscious like framework for how he remained curious. Thought goes in that goes, I don't know what that means, but you just used it in some context that you assumed I would possibly understand. Right? He's like, I don't know what that means. So, hey, what does that mean?
sure,
There was just no filtration in stopping the thought from curiosity. I think as adults, we're afraid we're afraid of looking stupid. We're afraid of however we'll be perceived. We're afraid that, and I've been there. Like, I tell you 10,000 stories of the times I should have asked better questions or questions at all that I didn't because of perception. But invariably, what you find is that by refusing to ask the question,
Hmm.
you end up as worse off than if you had just asked from the place of curiosity up front.
Mm-hmm.
Pretending that you know the answer initially is actually counterproductive. We've been conditioned as adults to get out of the questioning framework.
And that's a really good point. The childlike curiosity that you mentioned, and it is lost into that. There's childlike imagination that is also lost into
Yeah,
the age
big
frame.
time.
There's possibilities that are lost that way too, which I think are a fascinating note into that. There's no doubt. There's an old adage to that, and you alluded to it. I think it goes something along the foolish for a moment or foolish for a lifetime, right? So you can ask a silly question that can appear silly, but gain an answer, right? And that's fine. Or just let your fear of having perception into that room that you're in and never know the answer and be foolish for a lifetime. I just think that those are restrictions that you really have to be open to, and you have to build up a tolerance and comfort. The sooner, the better. All of these things are going to make you a better conversationalist. They're going to help you ask better questions and interpret that for elicited answers. I think that's important. But build real rapport and break down the walls. To me, this one is a fundamental. And Eric, you're excellent at this. I absolutely love the way that you break this down. So I definitely want to get your opinion on it. But the one that I'm thinking about is the capability of being playful in your conversations with somebody. There's so many rigid rules that we have to abide by, and that we're too concerned about the perception of somebody if we throw humor into the equation. Now, humor or playfulness when we're asking questions, but then also humor and playfulness when we're answering them. I think it goes a two-way street. What's nice about that is there is a give and take. Look, if you are going to give something that makes someone laugh, and if it's at your own expense or theirs, be willing to receive that. You have to give and take. Some people are better givers when it comes to poking fun versus takers. So I think that's a flaw in people. But I think that people are just not willing to take the risk. And I will tell you that the best interviews that I've ever, had, the best conversations that I've ever had, I've stepped out on a limb and I've said something that was silly and, really just going out there. And for me, it's been phenomenal. It's been received into that nature. Knock on wood, I haven't been left out on a limb pretty long, pretty hard that way. But you gotta try. So, what are your thoughts on being playful kind of teasing, playful in your dialogue conversation, when to throw in humor at the right time as you're kind of really getting to know somebody, to build rapport, to ask questions. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. So you think through. There's a few different frameworks of how you approach that. One, if you're asking questions or if you're responding, when you're responding, especially if you're getting like an interview or if you're on a first date, which I don't recommend that you do, Greg. I don't think your wife is going to be a fan of that. But if you're,
Not at all.
if if the listener is on a first date, so your goal is to be authentic and memorable.
Mhm.
Right? And so much communication, so much of our day and life is fails to be memorable.
Mhm.
So what we're looking then for is to create attention or stand out,
Mhm.
be differentiating in some capacity. And so one of the ways to do that, of course, is with humor. I mean, humor creates a parallel that creates this paradigm that causes these taboo topics to become discussed in a way that really shines light, unlike any other mechanism of communication. Humor is the one that allows us to like see the flaws in the ideology of humanity. And yeah, George Carlin, fantastic at things like Dave Chappelle, Andrew Schultz, all of them do a fantastic job of taking these off limit topics that would get you canceled and just bringing them to the forefront with humor. And so then it becomes a matter of art and some science, right? And so one of the most effective ways then is to be self-deprecating first.
Love it.
If you're unaware of how to inject humor, you can always inject it into the situation of like self-deprecation. I have taken a few. This is going to surprise you. It's going to really surprise the listener.
It probably won't.
But I've taken some public speaking training and courses with a public speaker that I really like, who's previously like a world champion public speaker with Toastmasters. And one of his point is you should never inject or insert humor into a story. You should extract the humor that exists from this story. And that's because there really are multiple dialogues that take place during any interaction. And that's the dialogue that you have with the person that you're in conversation with. It's the dialogue that the person is having with you when you're in conversation with them. And it's the dialogue you have with yourself, or potentially the dialogue of the other party.
Sure.
And so if you think about it, I'm going to project that potentially onto the person I'm in a conversation with. I might project it onto the audience, and then bring the humor into the scenario. And so, maybe a good example of that would be, as I'm just trying to think of one on the fly here, is that the audience, if you and I are in a conversation, I might go, "You're looking at me like I have three eyes," whatever it is.
Sure.
I mean, that's not funny, I realize, but I'm going to interject this unspoken dialogue of perception, the inner dialogue, and I'm going to project it onto you or project it onto me in order to bring humor into the conversation, in order to break that dynamic. And what it really does is it makes you stand out, and then of course it eases the tension of the back and forth.
I think the way that you mentioned that is huge, and the self-deprecation. I think there's a fine line. I mean, you don't want to overdo any of these, rules or mentionings that we're saying, but I think tastefully done can open up that comfort, as you mentioned, and allow people to not take themselves so seriously. I think ultimately what happens is that if you don't go down those roads, and if you don't try to attempt certain things that maybe make you feel uncomfortable or you might not know where that conversation or relationship could go. So test and try. I think that that's something important, but to master that art, is a wonderful thing. And you can really feel the intentionality. Like when you and I have conversations, Eric, it's so wonderful when you and I just go back and forth. We start laughing, joking, that sort of thing. We just out of the blue, just start talking about things. And to me, that's where I think people can learn and grow from that. There's a comfort to that. And you can build that quickly with somebody if you have intentionality or thought process. When you got to listen, you have to listen to the opportunity, and you have to be focusing on when the right time is. You know, you don't want to just show up with a list of punchlines or dad jokes. That's not that's not the whole
No,
goal with being
no.
playful. You know,
Yeah.
or showing that nature into that. And again, I think it's a two-way street. Um,
Well, I'll give you a perfect example of this that you just said. So I'm interviewing Captain Phillips, the not Tom Hanks, but the actual Captain Phillips next week.
both cool, by
And
the way. So
yeah, yeah, Tom Hanks would be a little cooler, but he would have been way more costly to get to show up. But that's okay. And so I'm interviewing not Tom Hanks, Captain Phillips, and they, you know, we were going back and forth internally as a company, like who was going to take that interview, and they're like, okay, Eric, we're gonna have you do it because you'll insert some, you know, ridiculous comments and zingers,
great.
and I'm like, gosh, okay, I don't know anything about this dude.
Mm.
So to the very first part of the conversation that you said, which Greg was, then I was like, I better go figure out something before I walk into this conversation. I better understand the person that I'm having a conversation with, because my thought process is when you bring humor into a conversation, if you're going to bring it to the other person, if you're not going to be self-deprecating, but if I'm going to be, you know, if I'm going to be deprecating about you, I'm not actually going to do it with something that's going to cause you to be upset.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or be offended, right? It's going to be something that's so farcical that it doesn't even seem realistic, so that there's no emotion behind it other than humor, instead of being seen as personal or as an attack.
Mm-hmm.
And so in preparation for that interview, those are the things I'm looking for.
I think you nailed it with that. And by the way, that's going to be an incredible interview. I know it. Just the way that you pull, you know, information out of people, it's phenomenal. And to me, that framework is the same, just as anything else. I mean, doing a deep dive, you know, kind of having that parroted, you know, sort of highlight reel to know, but not the surface level information that everybody knows, but kind of deeper past sort of scenario. When you're talking to somebody who's celebritized or well known, in addition to just, you know, the everyday person, if you want to break it down that way, that's when you can really shock and surprise and say, wow, Eric was well researched. How did he know that I did that with my brother when I was a teenager in the backwoods of this town? That just opens up incredible opportunities for deeper, non-surface level, typical conversations. And I'll tell you, anybody that I've interviewed that is celebritized the notoriety, because I've had all the HGTV, Bravo TV, you know, $1 Million Listing, you know, celebrities on the show through Titans. And, you know, to ask them the same questions over and over, they get asked 1 million times. So somebody who is on that level, who is interviewed consistently, you need to dive deeper. You need to dive real deep to have a meaningful conversation. Otherwise, you're going to blend in just like anybody else. You're going to be the same talking head, which is not what anybody wants to do. And you're not going to be memorable. And the content just not going to show up. This is something that is interesting too. And Eric, you already did it. You did it earlier on. And you're wonderful at doing this, is comfortably expressing a different opinion. Because I think ultimately, this is something that I've always worked on myself, is to not be agreeable just to appease the guest, right? On the show, or if it ends up being a one-to-one conversation. I think that that's something that if we can all take away, there are positive ways to understand where that person's coming from, reiterate their belief system, and then inject your own in contrast. That is a tasteful and clean, comfortable way for you not to be agreeable with everything. And I think ultimately it shows you have a backbone. And two, you have a different opinion that's going to engage into maybe a passionate conversation back and forth, which is phenomenal. So when you're thinking about this into your mind, Eric, and somebody says something, you're like, nah, no. How do you prepare yourself into that thought to say, I want to disagree with this person, but I don't want to, you know, slap them in the face at the same time? So
depends on how old you are and how big, you know, our male brains, they evolve at a significantly slower rate than all other human brains, and so I've done it both ways. You know, I started in radio and TV as a 10-year-old, and so you know, I can remember being just a total idiot And, that was like last week or something. And I remember being just a total moron. I'm in Tucson, Arizona. I'm 22 years old and work for the ABC station there as a video journalist. And there's a guy burning the Mexican flag in downtown Tucson. We're 2.5 hours, 2 hours from the U.S. and Mexico border, and this guy's got a bullhorn and burning the Mexican flag, making a giant scene about it. And I go shove a camera in his face and ask him the most arrogantly ridiculous questions. No softening to him, just punching him in the face with stupidity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that way. If your goal is to do the gotcha route where you think that you're the hero of the conversation, you can go that route.
Yeah.
That's the most ineffective way to disagree, because what you end up with is just disagreement. So what I've learned is that you have to take the position of, and it doesn't mean that I can do this all the time, right? But you take the position with time and focused effort on, do I want to be right or do I want to do what's right? And sometimes doing what's right is being wrong. And I operate from the place of, I would rather be wrong. All I actually would prefer to do is be wrong, because every time that I'm wrong, I get a little bit more right. And so go into the disagreement or go into something that you don't necessarily see that person's perspective on, or you don't understand, and you ask for permission to disagree. And you ask for permission to understand a perspective, or you ask for permission to share your perspective, because you want to start from the place of getting from across the table to side by side. I don't know why I just think of this like I'm watching this like eagle eye view of a conversation happen, and I'm having this out of body experience, and I saddle up next to you at the table, and I want to get your permission to sit down next to you for us to have a conversation to do what's right, instead of to be right. And that starts by getting collaboration and permission instead of disagreeing. And that can be challenging. So Phil Jones, who I think has a fantastic few books about words, about questions, about sales. He says the worst time to think about what to say is when you're saying it.
Fair enough.
And the best time to think about what to say is before the words come out of your mouth. And the very best way to do that is to have a repertoire of go-to questions or go-to responses or go-to strategies and tactics in order to gain the most effective alignment or the most effective perspective. And so I'm going to take that same application to a time in which we don't agree, and try to get perspective and see, because if I can get permission, we can get closer to whatever the right solution is. It can frustrate the shit out of people though, but it's doing what's right.
But I think the way that you had portrayed that out there, to have an uncomfortable conversation and make it comfortable, I think is an ultimate thing. And that allows the doors to open up for that deeper conversation. And there's that continued adage, we agree to disagree. That's fine. You can have completely different thought processes and keep going down the road. But when you put the hard block up, it can end a conversation very quickly. So this is something that I think, if you're going to go down this road, to do it from a place, a framework of, let me put myself in their shoes. Why are they thinking this? Why are they feeling that? And then let me see what I agree and what I disagree with, and give my perspective in a tasteful way, to kind of keep the conversation on track, to dive deeper into the relationship and the person. When we're talking about this next step here, I think for me, as I'm evaluating it, okay, so we've really gone down the road of breaking this conversation down is to have it really affect. One thing that I really try to focus on is obviously being in the moment, being present, because I think that there's so many distractions going along. So when you're with somebody, if it's your spouse, your kid, if it's a team member, if it's a client, they know if you're there or not. They know if Eric's head is in a million different places and he's thinking about, all the list of things he's got to get done prior to this. So he's going through the motion, versus, do I really get to have a moment with him? Do I really get to experience the true conversation, the back and forth nature? Am I enriched by that? I think that that's crucially important. Another thing to take on that note is actually being excited to be with somebody. People can feel that energy and emotion. So anytime I'm there with somebody, I try to show a level of care. The fact that, there's a million.
What do you do when you don't want to be there?
You shouldn't have
That's the one I struggle with.
You shouldn't have a conversation. To me, if you really aren't in it, you shouldn't be there. I'm a believer into that. If you're just putting on a face or a show, I'm just not a fan. I think it's disingenuous.
That's the skill that I have to get. That's the skill I have to get better at, is actually just stopping the conversation when I don't want to be in the conversation.
Leave, walk away.
Most of my day is filled with a lot of those. It seems like.
But think about it, Eric. You're feeling this way. A ton of people feel the same way. And it's not to say literally just pick up and if you got a friend on the phone and they're nonstop, you throw the phone, hang up and go. Or if you're in a meeting, you just stand up and walk away. Ultimately, if you don't like the topic of conversation, then change the topic. Right? I think it's important you have power in words. And if you're listening enough, there's a way to position it so that you can move on gracefully. Some of the best interviewers and people that are out there in the world, they're really understanding how to use this into finite detail. But for me, it's, look, if I'm not excited about the people that I'm around and want to be, then why am I there in the first place? Don't set yourself up for failure ahead of time. You're not going to be the best version of yourself. You're not going to give advice. You're not going to listen the way that you should. That is easier said than done. Maybe that's another topic of conversation to go through, Eric. But
I am not the expert on that. No one wants to take advice from me on that one. That has been long held struggle of mine. That's probably a very common area of growth opportunity, is getting out of conversations that don't move anyone forward. In the airplane mode button is a really good option on your phone. When you want to do that. I just love it when people just are like, "Hey, I got to go. I don't need an explanation."
Yeah.
But I'm a Midwesterner here, Greg. We've got this whole Hoosier hospitality thing that we think is how we have to show up everywhere. And I don't disagree with you. What's unkind is to stay in an ineffective conversation and to waste someone's most precious resource without helping them. Or without helping, anyone, and yet most people do that, but especially myself.
I agree. If it's painful, make a statement. Say something. Don't sit in it. Don't just stew in there and then walk away. Why? Say something. I think ultimately that's the way to go about it. That's just my perspective, how I live. Everyone's different, but again, this is why we're going down this line. Is I think it is important to do this, and this is another way that I look at conversation. Had some of the most in-depth conversations with complete strangers into my life where there was tears flowing. Some of the ugliest, dirtiest parts of life that you can possibly imagine have been shared live over these conversations, utilizing these things. Deep emotional connections. When I go to this process here, I think, how do I and how have I had these conversations with these giants of industry? And they're literally telling me every tiny detail of their life. And they've told me I've never shared this publicly. I've never gone over this thing. It's almost opening the doors to these intimate conversations. I will tell you, the big takeaway for me is, you already mentioned it, Eric, the self-deprecation note. You can't wait for people to step in. If you want somebody to be emotionally connected to you, to share something that's intimate into their life and into their world, to have a deeper understanding, you need to step into it and you need to share some of your own. If you're not willing to go there, don't expect somebody to not go there with you. Now, we'll tell you that acknowledging vulnerability is huge. So if somebody shares something with you, don't just quickly move on to the next question. If they talked about a family death or a massive impact into their life and how they were raised, or, drug addiction or abuse, anything along those lines, you need to go down that road and acknowledge the fact that they had courage to actually share it and say it out loud.
Yeah.
I think that that's one thing that people are looking. So if you go down that road with somebody, don't just skip on and then say, "Oh, I went through that too." Or try to find a bridge where it takes it off of them and puts it straight onto you. That's the dirtiest thing that you could do, and people do it all the time.
Yeah.
Acknowledge them and share that you appreciate their courage. If you have a bridge,
Yeah.
use it. But if not, just let them have their moment. You do that and they will continually open up. Now, if there is something to share in correlation, whether you did it before or after, share it. Have an intimate conversation. Go there. I will tell you, those are some of the deepest relationships you'll have. Those people that are saying these things aren't just saying that and handing that out like popcorn, like candy. So what are your thoughts on going there with people, Eric? I mean, having really kind of ugly, truthful conversations and sharing some intimate things. I mean, what's your perspective on vulnerability, courage, and then really just looking at it for your own nature?
For the most part, I have gotten way past the idea of privacy and having secrets. And so, for me, I don't necessarily care one way or the other. So vulnerability is not a limitation that I have necessarily.
Mm.
And yet I understand that not everyone is at that place.
Yeah.
And, it's probably enough time in therapy to get to that position
Sure.
of acceptance. And so, then you go to the questions of like, you start, when you're having conversations with someone and you're escalating the questions or the magnitude of it. Like, Greg, what do you, what would, if you think about you're 80 years old, what would be your biggest regret in life if you were reflecting on it? What's the one thing that you want to avoid happening between now and the time that you're, on your last days? What would you regret the most, or like, what are you afraid of the most? What keeps you up at night? If the front page of the New York Times had your name and this on it, what would be your biggest fear?
Sure.
Or what would you be most worried about? And you just get there by asking questions that cause people to respond with transparency and have to pause and think about the actual answer without giving you a canned BS response, something that they don't get from others. So you catch them off guard.
Well said, Eric. I love that tone into it. You're looking at it from, again, the whole point of this conversation is asking those deeper questions and really connecting in a meaningful way. And this overextends and transcends any of the conversation that we have. The last thing that I have in here, which I think is what I call superpower kind of mode, to kind of cap this whole thing off. If I'm really encompassing the conversation as a whole and communicating with people to one and getting intimate and building relationships and standing out, being long lasting, remember what we all have to think about. People are going to forget what you said. They're going to always remember how you made them feel. And I think the important nature of that is you need to see the person you're talking to. And I don't care, if it ends up being Captain Phillips, right? Or if it's Tom Hanks, or if it's Eric Forney. You have to look at these superstars, right?
Yeah.
As humans. They're people. They live life just like you. And I don't care what money's in your bank account or what accomplishments you have or awards you've won. We all live life, right? So kids, interests, ironic situations, real everyday life. Once you put that person into a real human body scenario, the conversation gets a lot easier. So it just gets rid of all the rest of it. And let's just cut through to people, the human condition of a conversation. To me, that's everlasting. And that is a superpower. If you can really just block out anything and just get right to it, we're all humans. We're all people underneath. We all have the same struggles and pains, joys and successes and failures. Those are where things really, really grow. So the last note in conversation, Eric, that we're kind of going through here is the superpower. I think ultimately looking at it from a perspective that every single person on the planet that we're talking to, whether they end up being, a celebrity or, somebody who's well known into the community, it doesn't matter at the end of the day whether they've got, hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank account or, what walk of life they come through. We're all people. So understanding that if you just rip everything away and look at it from, I'm having a conversation with a person just like me, right? Having pain the same way, joy and happiness and everything that's going, they live real lives. They have kids, they have interests, they have hobbies, real everyday life sort of scenarios. The conversation can get very connected right? Talking about ironic details into life that people wouldn't think to go down. So we put a lot of weight and perspective on what people are perceived to. And I think having a superpower of just understanding that every single person that we talk to, from our spouse to our children, obviously into team, if you're on stage, or if it ends up being a one-to-one conversation with a celebritized individual, they're all people. We all are. And I think ultimately that's where a big superpower and success can lie. It's just having real conversations with real people, not surface level. So that was the goal today. Incredible conversations going through. So just follow those steps. You're going to be a much better conversationalist and truly get to the root of the emotion, the connectivity, one-to-one with an individual, build massive rapport, and most importantly, leave a lasting impression. Because remember, at the end of the day, people will forget what you say, but they're not going to forget how you made them feel. Great episode today on Disruptance. We'll catch everybody in the next one. Take